the Fair Housing Act is one of our nation's strongest fair housing laws. So I think it's very effective as an advocacy tool, but there also, if those advocacy efforts don't succeed, there's a number of different procedures that can be put into place to enforce the fair housing rights of older adults. So for example, there is an administrative complaint procedure under state or local law, or if it falls within one of the federal protected classes with HUD, which allows someone to file an administrative complaint, which is something less than a lawsuit. So it's a situation where a governmental entity will investigate the claim of discrimination and make a determination as to whether or not discrimination has occurred. And it's designed to be a much more informal process. The investigator would probably interview the person who's claiming disability along with possibly the homeless service provider and collect documents and then make a determination about whether or not discrimination occurred. So it's less onerous than a lawsuit. And of course, there's also lawsuits are available under the Fair Housing Act and have been brought in cases where someone is trying to get into housing but can't obtain it. So there are what's called temporary restraining orders that can be obtained that will say, where a court will say to the housing provider, you have to let this person in because there's evidence of discrimination here. If someone thinks that they have been discriminated against based on age, a homeless service provider believes that someone has been discriminated based on their age, there's a couple of different things to do. The first thing that might be helpful is to contact a fair housing organization. So those are NAFA members. So there are fair housing organizations across the country that receive government funding. Some of them receive government funding, some of them do not. But they're put in place to help people who have possibly experienced discrimination pursue their claims. So that might be either advocacy, or it could be an administrative complaint, or it could be a lawsuit. But probably advocacy is probably the first focus. So if the homeless service provider contacts one of NAFA's members, they can help them through the process and can hear about the problem and then provide them with some advice on how to approach that issue. I wanted to mention just a couple of different specific discriminatory practices which people experiencing homelessness may face. And so the first is, we talked a little bit about the overlap with disability. And there is a provision of the Fair Housing Act which allows someone to obtain a change in a rule, practice, policy, or procedure if the change is necessary for the person to have equal access to housing. So an example might be if someone who is experiencing homelessness is having trouble climbing stairs, like they're in a second floor apartment and they start having trouble climbing stairs, they might be, if that is a disability, then they should be able to obtain a first floor apartment or some other change in the policy that would allow them to have housing, which would not require them to climb stairs. So it might be a first floor apartment. It might be transferring them to another apartment complex where there's a first floor apartment available, but there's a whole huge range of different types of reasonable accommodations that could be covered. If somebody is on a public benefit and they receive their benefit checks after the first of the month, there are a number of cases that say a housing provider needs to make an accommodation that allows them to pay their rent after the first of the month. So it's hard to say all the different types of reasonable accommodations that might apply, but it's a very powerful tool for someone who is an older adult, has a disability and needs some change that would allow them to live in the housing, continue to live in the housing. So that's a very strong provision. Also, under state and local laws, there's prohibitions on source of income, which includes housing choice vouchers and many of the other vouchers that people experiencing homelessness may have. So Veterans Affairs supportive housing vouchers, emergency housing vouchers, just about any type of voucher would be covered in those states and localities which have source of income protections. And I think, again, I think those protections can be most powerful to be used to advocate to obtain housing for people experiencing homelessness. So either the homeless service provider or the homeless service provider, in conjunction with the fair housing organization, can advocate with the housing provider to get them to obtain housing. But it also allows people to file administrative complaints that we talked about, or file a lawsuit, which can require the housing provider to allow the person experiencing homelessness to get housing. So there have been some very successful cases where they were able to get an order from the court to force the housing provider to provide the housing, to accept the voucher and provide the housing to the person experiencing homelessness. And then I think the last area that I wanted to touch on, well, maybe let me touch on one more area that would deal with individuals, and then let me mention something that might that could assist in more where there are more systemic issues. So the last thing that I wanted to mention for regarding individuals is that there are laws that prohibit people or housing providers from refusing to rent to people with criminal backgrounds. So if there's an older adult and they have a criminal background, there are laws that require housing providers not to have a blanket policy that prohibits, certain types of offenses, felonies, or misdemeanors, but they have to consider the criminal convictions on an individual level. So that's another area. I know that there are some people who have experienced homelessness who have some, misdemeanor convictions just from the fact that they're out there experiencing homelessness. And so that's another provision that can help. Again, I think it's probably most effective as an advocacy tool, but there have been a number of lawsuits that have been brought on criminal background. And then I think the last thing I wanted to just mention in terms of the practices that are prohibited is that on a sort of broader level, if homeless service providers have housing that they're trying to build or locate in communities, it can be used, the fair housing laws can be used to prevent discrimination in land use and zoning. And there have been a number of cases where the fair housing laws have been effectively used to allow people housing that's intended for people in protected classes to be built in different communities. So the Fair Housing Act is a very powerful tool. It both prohibits individual discrimination, but also can be used to deal with more systemic discrimination, like in discrimination in land use and zoning.